She carried a water-stained painting 12 blocks through downtown Cincinnati in February because she couldn't afford a cab. Her family had already driven home laughing. But when the specialist at Weston and Hirsch Fine Art leaned over the torn canvas edge and slowly sat down on the floor, just sat straight down like his legs stopped working, everything changed. He didn't make her an offer. He picked up the phone and called the Smithsonian. The afternoon light coming through the tall windows of Gerald Whitman and Associates law office was the pale, cheerless kind that belongs to February in Ohio. The kind that doesn't warm anything, just reminds you how long winter has been going. Vera Holloway, 32 years old, sat with her coat still on in a chair that was too formal for how exhausted she was. Her coat was clean but thin. She'd been meaning to replace it for 2 winters now. Across the room, her older brother Dennis sat with his arms crossed and one ankle resting on his knee, the posture of a man who had already mentally deposited his check. His wife Patrice kept her eyes on her phone. Their cousin Owen leaned against the window frame, eating a granola bar, which felt obscene given the occasion. But Owen had always treated other people's grief as a mild inconvenience to his schedule. They were there for the reading of Ruth Holloway's estate. Ruth had been 81 when she died, and formidable right up until the last 8 months. She'd taught high school English for 34 years, raised 2 kids mostly alone after Vera and Dennis's grandfather left, and run her household in Clifton with the quiet precision of someone who trusted no one to do things correctly, except herself. She'd been right about that, mostly. When the dementia came, it came fast, the way it does sometimes, like a light being turned off room by room. And when it became clear that Ruth could no longer safely manage the stairs, the medications, the stove she kept forgetting to turn off, Dennis had a family meeting via group text and announced that professional care is really the responsible choice here. He offered to split the cost of a facility. Vera had driven to Cincinnati instead. She'd given notice at her apartment in Columbus, packed what fit in her car, and moved into her grandmother's spare room. That was 3 years and 4 months ago. She'd found a part-time position teaching art at a middle school 40 minutes away, which paid enough to cover her own basic expenses, but not much beyond that. She changed Ruth's medications twice a day. She sat with her through the nights when the confusion was worst, when Ruth would wake up calling for people who'd been dead for decades. She learned to cook the specific way Ruth had always liked. Real butter, not margarine, soup from scratch on Sundays. She held her grandmother's hand the morning Ruth finally stopped breathing, and she was the one who called Dennis to let him know. Dennis had flown in for the funeral. He stayed 2 nights. Leonard Grimes, the attorney, was a compact man with a deliberate, unhurried voice that seemed engineered to make difficult things sound matter-of-fact. He read through the estate in order. Dennis received the Clifton house, a 4-bedroom Victorian that had been in the family since 1962, currently assessed at $410,000, along with Ruth's investment portfolio and a savings account that together added up to just over $300,000. Patrice, who had visited Ruth exactly once in 3 years, received Ruth's jewelry: pearl earrings, a garnet brooch, 2 gold chains, and a small diamond ring from the 40s that Dennis had once told Vera was probably worth something significant. Owen received a cash bequest of $60,000 from a separate account Ruth had maintained. Owen looked up from his granola bar long enough to nod, as if this confirmed something he'd already calculated. Then Leonard looked down at the last line and cleared his throat. To my granddaughter Vera, in recognition of her presence, I leave the oil painting currently stored in the upstairs hallway, the large one in the damaged frame, along with whatever meaning it holds. The room was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then Dennis laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh, exactly. It was the laugh of someone who finds something so absurd that they can't help themselves. Patrice pressed her lips together in a way that meant she was working not to join him. "The hallway painting?" Dennis said. He looked at Vera. "V, that thing is wrecked." It's got a water stain the size of a dinner plate. The frame's rotted through on one corner, Owen added helpfully. Vera kept her eyes on the attorney's desk. Is that all? That's the complete estate as documented, Leonard said. He met her eyes briefly, and she couldn't read what was in his. Dennis leaned forward. Listen, I know it seems. Look, I'm sure she meant something by it. You know how she was. Sentimental. He was already buttoning his coat. I'll see about getting the painting wrapped up so you can take it. You've always been into that stuff anyway. After they left, Vera sat alone in the conference room for several minutes. She wasn't crying. She was doing the math she'd been avoiding. The checking account she'd depleted over the past 3 years. The credit card she'd put her own health insurance on for 14 months when she was technically between jobs. The student loan she'd paused but not eliminated. The car that needed a water pump she'd been ignoring since November. She had $412 in her bank account. She had given Ruth 3 years of her life, not out of calculation, not waiting for payment, just because Ruth had no one else, and Vera was not the kind of person who could live with herself if she'd chosen otherwise. She understood that. She still understood it. It didn't make the math easier. The painting was leaned against the hallway wall, just where it always had been, between the bathroom door and the linen closet. Vera had passed it so many times over the past 3 years that she'd stopped seeing it. It was large, maybe 2 feet by 3, and depicted what seemed to be a rocky coastal landscape at dusk with a ship in the distant water. The colors had darkened with age to something murky and indistinct. A water stain ran diagonally across the lower left third, fading the image there to a ghostly wash. The frame had separated at the bottom right corner, the wood soft and crumbling where moisture had gotten in. Someone, Ruth or someone before her, had touched up a section near the top with paint that didn't quite match, leaving a small smear of too bright blue. It was genuinely not a beautiful painting. Vera wrapped it in a moving blanket she found in the garage, tied it with twine, and carried it to her car. She was back in her old Columbus apartment. She'd kept paying the rent remotely, the one financial decision she now recognized as lucky, when her phone rang. Dennis's name on the screen. She almost didn't answer. "Hey," he said. His voice had the particular lightness of someone who wants to sound casual about something they're not casual about. "How are you doing? Getting settled back in?" "I'm fine." "Good. Good." A pause. "Listen, I wanted to say, I know this wasn't what you were expecting. Honestly, none of us really understood what she was thinking." "It's okay, Dennis." "The thing is," he stopped. When he continued, his tone had shifted slightly, something careful under it. "I actually talked to Grandma Ruth about this, about 3 months ago when I visited." Vera was quiet. "She asked me what I thought she should leave you. She was having a good day. She was sharp. She wanted to make sure things felt fair. And I told her, I said, Vera's always been the artistic one. She'd probably appreciate something meaningful more than money. And I mentioned the painting because you used to stop and look at it when you were little. I thought she might like that idea." He paused. "I genuinely thought I was helping." Vera sat very still on her couch. "You suggested it," she said. "I was trying to be thoughtful. You suggested that she leave me a damaged painting instead of any of the money. It wasn't, I didn't think of it that way." Vera hung up. She stayed on the couch for a long time after that. The painting leaned against her wall in its moving blanket, taking up a significant portion of the small room. She looked at it. Dennis hadn't suggested it out of cruelty, exactly. She almost believed that. He'd suggested it because it hadn't occurred to him that she needed anything. Because people who don't struggle rarely understand that other people do. He'd offered her a sentimental object because he thought she was the sentimental type. And money was for people who required money, which in his understanding was not Vera. She turned on the lamp and looked at the painting for the first time with actual attention. The coastal scene was competent, but not remarkable. At least the parts she could see through the grime and the water damage. but there was something about the brushwork along the right edge that she'd noticed peripherally before and never examined. Beneath the years of darkened varnish, the strokes in the undamaged area had a kind of energy to them, a decisiveness that seemed at odds with the generic subject matter. She'd taught art to 12-year-olds for 6 years. She'd looked at a lot of paintings. There was something different here, though she couldn't have said exactly what. She looked at the back. The canvas was old. The fabric itself was stiff and discolored in a way that suggested significant age. There was a label in the upper right corner, a rectangle of paper almost completely illegible with age. The ink faded to near nothing. She could make out 2 letters, something that might be a W, and what looked like an H or an N. She looked up Weston and Hirsch Fine Art on her phone. They were the only auction house-level gallery in Cincinnati, the kind of place she had walked past but never entered. Their website said they handled estates and collections and provided appraisals for works of significant historical interest. She told herself it was almost certainly nothing. She went anyway, because $412 is a number that dissolves your pride fairly efficiently. Weston and Hirsch occupied a brownstone on 4th Street that smelled the way expensive old things smell. Wood polish and cool air and the faint chemical trace of conservation work. The receptionist's expression performed a polite neutrality when Vera walked in with the painting under her arm, wrapped in a moving blanket, wearing her thin coat. Callum Weston was 47, 3rd generation in the family business, and wore the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades being right about things other people couldn't see. He came out to the front because the receptionist buzzed him with someone with a piece she'd like evaluated, and he appeared with the professional expression of a person prepared to be brief. He looked at the moving blanket. "I know it looks bad," Vera said before he could say anything. I need someone to look at it, even just for a minute. I'm not here to waste your time." Something in her voice, or possibly the particular flatness of someone who has run out of alternatives, made him pause. He nodded toward the back room. She unwrapped the painting on his examination table under the bright, clean track lighting, and in that environment it looked worse than it had in her apartment. The water damage was vivid under proper light. The separated frame corner gaped. Callum stood with his arms crossed, head slightly tilted, doing her the courtesy of actually looking. "Coastal scene, oil on canvas," he said, mostly to himself. "Frame is late 19th century, American, but replacements were common, so that's not conclusive." He was reaching for a magnifying glass, clearly more out of professional habit than expectation. "Is there any provenance? Any documentation with the piece?" "No, it was my grandmother's. She had it in her hallway." He leaned close to the right edge, the area with the distinctive brushwork, and was quiet for a moment. Then he shifted the magnifier to the lower left, the water-damaged section. Then he straightened up and looked at the back. He found the label. Vera watched him go very still. He produced a small flashlight from his desk drawer and directed it at the faded paper from an angle, the way you'd read something in low relief. His hand, she noticed, was not entirely steady. He set the flashlight down. He looked at her. Then he looked back at the painting. He put on a pair of cotton gloves and very gently, along the bottom edge where the frame had separated, applied the lightest pressure to the canvas. Not to the paint surface, but to the back edge, where the canvas was folded over the stretcher bar. In that margin, protected from the light and air for over a century, there was more of the original color. A stripe of undarkened paint, maybe an inch wide, running the full length of the bottom. The stripe was a luminous, extraordinary blue-green. Callum Weston sat down on his examination stool. He sat down the way people sit down when their legs make the decision before their brain does. Vera gripped the edge of the table. "Mr. Weston, what is it?" He put his hands over his face. Just for a moment, a brief unguarded moment she would remember for the rest of her life. When he lowered them, his eyes were wet. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry, He stopped, composing himself with visible effort, the way people do when they've been trained to be professional, and something has blown past that training entirely. Miss Holloway, where did your grandmother get this painting? I don't know. It was always just there, as far back as I can remember. He nodded slowly. He got up and went to the shelving along the wall, where a row of large reference binders sat. He pulled one and came back to the table, leafing through it with the deliberate speed of someone who already knows what he's looking for and needs to confirm it. He stopped, turned the binder so she could see. The page showed a black and white photograph of a painting, a coastal landscape at dusk, a ship in the water. The composition was identical to the painting on the table. The caption read, "Attributed to Winslow Homer. Last documented 1921. Current whereabouts unknown." Winslow Homer, Callum said, his voice lower now, like he was saying something almost too significant to say at normal volume, is considered by most serious scholars to be the greatest American painter of the 19th century. His authenticated works have sold at auction for over $30 million. He paused. This label, what's legible of it, is consistent with a private dealer's notation from the early 1900s. The brushwork on the right edge is consistent with his mature marine period. And that color, he gestured toward the stripe of preserved paint. That specific blue-green was a Homer signature in his Prout's neckwork. I've seen it in person at the Portland Museum of Art. He looked at her. This painting has been sitting in a hallway. In Cincinnati, Vera said. In Cincinnati. The silence in the examination room was the specific silence of something very large settling into place. I need to make some calls, Callum said. I want to bring in a conservator. Someone I trust. She's the best in the Midwest. And I need to contact a colleague at the Smithsonian American Art Museum who has spent 20 years looking for this piece. I also need to strongly suggest you contact an attorney before we go any further. He looked at her steadily. Miss Holloway, I don't want to overstate this before we have full authentication, but if this is what I believe it is, you are holding one of the most significant lost works in American art history. She didn't remember the drive back to her apartment. She remembered parking and sitting in the car for a while, not doing anything in particular. Her phone showed a text from Dennis. Let me know if you need any help with transition stuff. Happy to help find resources for you. She put the phone face down. She hadn't been willing to leave the painting behind, even wrapped and unwieldy as it was. She'd kept it with her the whole visit. Before she'd left Weston and Hirsch, while Callum was already on the phone, she'd taken one more look at the back of the canvas. She'd found something she'd missed before, a small envelope taped to the interior of the frame, in the space created by the separated corner. So old the tape had mostly lost its adhesion. Her grandmother's handwriting was on the envelope, thin, precise letters in the slightly labored hand of someone whose fine motor control had been declining. It was dated 14 months ago. Inside was a single folded sheet from a yellow legal pad. Vera, I know there are days I don't make much sense anymore, but I want you to know that I know exactly what I'm doing with this. Your great-uncle Walter brought this painting home in 1951 from an estate sale in Maine. He paid $11 for it and told me it looked like it might be something. Though he wasn't sure what, I always meant to have it looked at. I never got around to it. Dennis will tell you he suggested this. Let him believe he did me a favor. I've watched your brother his whole life look at things and see only what they're worth on the surface. I've watched you look at things and see what's underneath. That's not a small difference. That's the whole difference. The painting is yours, my love. So is whatever it turns out to be. Everything I had to give, I gave to the right person. All my love, Grandma Ruth. The authentication took 6 weeks. Weston and Hirsch brought in a conservation specialist named Dr. Anne Riley, who spent 3 days examining the work under multispectral imaging and infrared reflectography. The label, once properly analyzed by a document specialist, was confirmed as a notation from a Boston dealer who had handled several Homer works in the early 1900s. Dr. Riley's written assessment concluded, "This work is, in my professional opinion, an authentic Winslow Homer oil on canvas, circa 1895 to 1900, and represents one of the most important rediscoveries in American art history in the past 3 decades. The Smithsonian contacted Vera directly within 24 hours of Callum's initial call. She had hired an attorney before any of that, a woman named Patricia Sauer, a former federal art crimes prosecutor now in private practice, specializing in cultural property law, whose name Callum had given her, and who took the call on a Saturday afternoon because Callum told her it was worth the interruption. It was Patricia who was with Vera when the Thursday morning knock came. Dennis stood in the doorway of the Columbus apartment. He'd brought his own attorney, a man in an expensive suit who set a leather portfolio on the kitchen counter without being invited. Patrice stood just inside the door with the expression of someone managing a migraine. "This is family property," Dennis said. "That painting was in the family home, which is now my property as the estate beneficiary. It should have been included in the house inventory. The will was unclear, and we think if Grandma Ruth had understood what she was doing, she never would have." "She understood exactly what she was doing," Vera said. "She had dementia, Vera. She had dementia in the last 8 months of her life. The letter was written 14 months ago, and Dr. Ellen Marsh, her physician, has confirmed in writing that at that date Ruth was in full possession of testamentary capacity. Patricia has that documentation." Patricia Sauer, who had been sitting quietly at the kitchen table, set a folder on the counter next to Dennis's attorney's portfolio. She did it without particular drama, the way people who have been winning for a long time do things. "The will is unambiguous," Patricia said. "The painting is specifically itemized and specifically bequeathed. The estate was settled by a licensed attorney in the state of Ohio. If your client wants to contest, he's welcome to try, but I'd suggest he review his own financial situation first, because litigation is expensive, and what I'm seeing in the estate documents suggests his budget may be tighter than expected." Dennis looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the folder. The Clifton house, it turned out, had a tax lien. Ruth had let the property taxes fall behind over the past several years, and the arrears, plus penalties, came to just over $40,000, due immediately upon transfer of ownership. The investment portfolio held several positions that had been losing value for 18 months, and one account carried early withdrawal penalties Dennis's attorney apparently hadn't caught in the fine print. The total picture wasn't a disaster, but it wasn't the windfall Dennis had already spent in his head. Dennis's attorney leaned close and said something quietly. Dennis's face went through several things. "What are you going to do with it?" he finally said. He was looking at the moving blanket propped against the wall. His voice had lost its certainty entirely, and what was left underneath was something she recognized as the voice he'd had when they were children, genuine, a little lost. "The painting. What are you going to do?" Vera thought about that. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "The Smithsonian wants to exhibit it. 3 auction houses have been in contact. Patricia thinks we should take some time. It could be the number they're talking about. I know what the number is." He nodded. He picked up his portfolio. He didn't say he was sorry. She hadn't expected him to. But at the door he stopped, and she could see him working through something. "She always knew more than she let on," he said. "Not to Vera specifically. More to the room. Grandma Ruth, she always knew." "She knew you pretty well," Vera said. "She knew both of us." After they left, the apartment was very quiet. February light came through the windows, still pale, still cheerless. But the thin coat was going to be replaced. The water pump was going to be fixed. The student loan was going to be paid off in full, and something was going to be set aside for the kinds of mornings that don't announce themselves. The ones that show up unscheduled and expensive and alone. She sat for a while with the letter. She'd read it so many times she could have said it from memory. but she read it again anyway. Everything I had to give, I gave to the right person. Callum had told her during one of the authentication meetings that conservators had found something beneath the water-damaged section of the canvas, that the damage, ironically, had preserved a section of underpainting revealing Homer's original compositional sketch. The ruined part held the most information. The most damaged section was where the story was. She thought her grandmother would have found that funny. And exactly right. If you've ever been handed something broken and told it was all you deserved, if you've ever been the one left holding what nobody else wanted, then you know the specific weight Vera carried out of that law office. You know what it feels like before the painting turns out to be anything at all. The question was never what the painting was worth. The question was whether she would have carried it anyway. She did, and that's the whole story. If this one hit you somewhere real, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Like the video if you believe the right people eventually find what they're meant to find. And subscribe to keep the drama, because we're just getting started.